Welcome to the live stream for the ÉCRITS. It's actually been quite a while since I've done one of these live streams, but it's always fun to kick it live. I think it's a different experience, and specifically, I see this as well. So I do have something in the background. Yeah, that's always annoying. So yeah, that's just here in the continuity of different events that I've been holding in preparation for the ÉCRITS course, which will be the fourth philosophy portal course starting September 3rd. And I'm here with some of the crucial helpers and guest facilitators in the course. Dimitri Crooijmans, who has been on the channel before, I think mostly to talk about Enter the Alien, but I'm pretty sure there was another event as well that you've been on the channel. Yeah, Michelle's with us. Hi, Michelle. So we will be taking questions from people live. So we got Secret Asian Dan here, and Secret Asian Dan has not only an awesome YouTube name, but he's also enrolled in the course as well. So if you have any questions, Secret Asian Dan, feel free to drop that. We also have Nick Castellucci and Andrew Flores, the two vanishing mediators, or should I say the not two vanishing mediators, the not two. I've got to make sure I get that right. And we'll just say first, Dimitri's going to be leading exegetical reading spaces in the course, and Nick and Andrew are going to be helping out in the discussion spaces. And each aspect of these contributions is going to be special in my view. Dimitri, because he's been with Philosophy Portal for some time now, and he's developing his own line of thought, and I'm excited to have spaces where we can specifically dive into aspects of Lacan's text, which are specifically highlighting the importance of the return to Freud, and having those spaces is going to be really special. And then Nick and Andrew, I'm going to leave a link in the description, but if you check out their channel on the Vanishing Mediators, and I'll also leave a link in the channel to Dimitri's actual spirit. But if you check out the Vanishing Mediator channel, they've been doing seminars, focus on Lacan seminars. And I think that's going to be a really interesting balance to have the ÉCRITS on the one hand, and then Nick and Andrew's influence from the seminars. I think that's going to be powerful. So welcome, guys. Let's just, why don't you guys just introduce yourselves? Andrew, I know you wanted to say something. Did you want to say something before we start?
Oh yeah, I was just gonna make a joke saying like not only are Nick and I the not two, but we also, even if one of us is absent, we're knotted together, so we're not two because of the Borromean knot, and then we're the not two.
Got the wordplay going.
Yeah, exactly.
So why don't we and I think we've all sort of got a shared bond through hip hop as well. So hopefully that comes out in the class and maybe this live stream as well. But why don't we just start with introducing in order, Dimitri, Nick, Andrew, and then we'll dive into some questions from the audience, maybe some reflections on what we are anticipating in the course.
Sure. So I'm Dimitri. I am dogmatic Hegelian, and I am not. I haven't actually read Lacan very deeply even though I have read a lot of Freud. So yeah, I have a YouTube channel called Actual Spirit and a blog, and I mostly write articles about things that I deem of importance to actual spirit, which is the actuality of spirit, or how it, like different phenomena relate to the psyche and such. And I'm so excited to get into Lacan's ÉCRITS. It's I'm especially interested how the question of love or humor or things of that nature, comedy, would relate to Lacan. Yeah, that's it basically for me.
Hi everybody, I'm Nick. As Cadell mentioned, one half of the not two of the Vanishing Mediators. Andrew and I, we have a channel which for the moment is dedicated to working through the seminar of Jacques Lacan. I'm very passionate about Lacan's work. I was drawn to Lacan via Dave McCarricker and Michael Downs' conversation that they had about Lacan. This was in 2020, right? When was the pandemic? Was that 2020 or 2021? I can't even, my sense of time is all screwed, but yeah.
I think it broke out 2020.
Yeah, it was late 2020 that I got into Lacan via those guys. Check out Theory Underground, the site, the YouTube channel, and Michael Downs' blog, The Dangerous Maybe. I don't really consider myself a theorist per se. I'm just addicted to the jouissance that one can derive from studying Lacan on an ongoing basis. And other than that, I would consider myself a creative writer, working on some things. And instead of doing outright theory, I let theory sort of guide my creative process, let's say. So I'll just like kick it over to Andrew now.
Can everybody hear me? Yeah, so I mean, I like to say what Zizek says about like you can't know me outside of theory, and so knowing the key to my life won't help you understand why I got into Lacan. It's more of understanding Lacan will help you understand about my life, pretty much. So it's a deferred action retroactively. No, but I'm Andrew, aka the Big Signorelli. Like Nick said, we have a channel called the Vanishing Mediators, and similar to Nick, I got into Lacan around the time of the pandemic. I had Anti-Oedipus in my library, like for the longest. I didn't even know what it was. I just saw the book a while back, and I got it just because the cover looked cool. It was the Penguin Putnam, I think, or Penguin edition. And then I also got into Zizek during that time, and they both were talking about this guy named Lacan. I'm just like, okay, I got to read this guy. And then just figured out that like he was talking about Freud and psychoanalysis. I didn't even know that psychoanalysis was like a thing besides Freud and, you know, even like Jung. And so I was pretty much psychoanalytic pilled from there on. And also around that time, I discovered, you know, what was once called Theory Plebe, now called Theory Underground. You know, the lectures on Zizek and Lacan by Mikey and Dave. And then from there, what initiated my deep dive into the seminars specifically was I was getting into seminar 1 when I moved out to Virginia, and Brian Becker's channel, Singularity as Sublimity, had just came on the scene, and he was the only person that you could get as far as content creator that was going through all the seminars one by one, alongside with Heidegger's Being in Time. And I thought that was amazing. And so after that, I just started spearheading it, and then met Dave through IG, and Mikey, they brought me onto their channel. And then that's how I met Nick, because he was asking questions to Mikey about Lacan and stuff. And, you know, the rest is history. Now we're just knotted together. But as far as work goes, I pretty much, I'm focusing on my ideas right now. I don't write as much as I would like to. I think I'm more better at focusing on my, you know, vocals and my speaking. Not that I'm a great speaker, you know. I say a lot of but-ums and slang, but other than that, I try my best to at least be rigorous when it comes to breaking down these concepts. And I hope to write more commentary on Lacan seminars. So that's all I got to say.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, we were talking a little bit before the live stream started about the Dimitri, you brought up the insanity of the French scene, the incestuous nature of the French scene, and some of the weird sexual activity that was going on there. I'd be interested to connect that a little bit to your interest on humor and love. What do you think's going on with that French scene, and maybe what do you hope to investigate in the exegetical reading space or in the course itself on Lacan's notion of love, maybe connected to what you've been doing with Hegel?
Yeah, so I let me start by saying that Big Sig, I'll call you Big Sig. I like that name, Big Sig. The point you just made, I think that's tremendous, and and I completely agree with it. Like, if you want to know who I am, like, don't just like. I can tell you all the personal facts, and you can look at my eyes and things like that. But you're gonna find it in my articles and my podcasts, and like the actual theory I uphold and the creative results I bring. I have a project that I am like a Zizekian rapper, and I bring a lot of Zizekian, Hegelian, and Nietzschean theory into my raps. So that's where you really find who I am. But I think also, the obvious, the opposite also has some weight to it. So yeah, I'm definitely interested in the personal life of Lacan, and therefore, to prepare for the écrit, I'm reading a book on Lacan's wife, Sylvia Bataille, or Sylvia Lacan, after Lacan snatched her from him. So, well, yeah, in the intellectual scene of France, a lot happened. You have, for example, May '68, and the whole student revolts and the worker revolt. And there was one pervert I knew, um, and he had a great analysis of this period. He said that basically all those young guys, waving their flags and things like this, they just want to get sex, and this is why they are like doing all that revolutionary kind of stuff. Now, I used to be very much into political activism and used to go to demonstrations. And if I think back about this and think about May '68 being actually, like inclusive of like sexual liberation, whatever that means, yeah, it is a lot about like getting your sexual satisfaction by pretending it's for some um, greater good. Now, Lacan, I wouldn't say that's some kind of Lacanian analysis, but Lacan had an interesting response to May '68, right? He said, you're all hysterics who are looking for a new master, and so you will get one. Now, I think that makes complete sense to me, and I think the sexual liberation movement has been kind of a disaster. There's this reading of Freud that was popular in the 20th century, that everything that Freud talks about, facts like repression, the discontent in culture, um, we should rid ourselves from it and have a kind of sexual liberation, or a sexual revolution, as Wilhelm Reich coined it. Well, the thing is, well, now we are at a point that, especially theorists of the Slovenian school have developed this to the furthest extent, I believe, that we can see that this whole sexual liberation wasn't really what it thought it was. And like the whole idea that you can see in Herbert Marcuse, for example, with this idea of the one-dimensional man and transcending um, the being confined by monogamy and things like this. Um, there's something that wasn't seen there, and I believe Lacan did see it. I believe this is really like the whole meaning of Lacan's return to Freud is actually to think Freud on his own terms. And that doesn't mean immediately identifying with Freud. That doesn't mean Freud thought of everything. Like, there's many things Freud didn't think of and that Freud couldn't think of. Freud never had structural linguistics or proper philosophical education, for example. So he doesn't incorporate things like, also like Levi-Strauss or Hegelian dialectics or structural linguistics into his theory. But yeah, no, like the fidelity to Freud and the return to Freud does mean that we don't necessarily want to overcome Freud and want to immediately overcome all the inhibitions and problems of the unconscious, but rather will tarry with it. So that's some of the things I'm interested in by diving into the écrit itself. Yeah, and yeah, I do really think that there is something to be said here about like really how one's metaphysics or how one's deepest thoughts are manifested in one's daily spiritual existence. For example, very simple example. In theorizing the I, Hegel tells us, Kant actually expressed that he felt awkward about it. Now Hegel said this awkwardness is kind of laughable, because of course the I is kind of tautological, and if I want to think the I, well, I am already the I, so I am at once the subject as well as the object that I want to think. So what's happening here? Well, there's a contradiction there, obviously. Kant wanted to distance himself from this contradiction, and the effect he felt because of this was awkwardness. That's what Hegel claims. Now, I'm not saying this is really some kind of final and definitive statement, but there's something about learning theory and manifesting and the way you're comporting yourself in daily life. So yeah, definitely Lacan for me is also like learning Lacan is also for personal transformation, or like really my daily life. I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'm not 100% sure where to go next, except for this distinction you were making, which might be interesting to get the Vanishing Mediator's take on of the theory and the personal, and the relationship between the theory and the personal. Do either of you, Andrew or Nick, feel called to approach that question?
Sure.
Yeah, I definitely feel that, like, no matter, like, especially when you get into not just philosophy but psychoanalysis, it's a sort of discourse that doesn't take you away from the personal, but actually structures the personal, and you realize that what is personal is actually social. And I think what the symptom does, and this is why I love Zizek's in Sublime Object of Ideology, he talks about the symptom of Marx inventing the symptom, not Freud, but they both kind of discover something radical that, for lack of a better term, it's a social symptom. And so our personal, our imaginary identification is only just a sort of inversion, reflection of the, what we could call in German, the Umwelt, the milieu, the environment, the symbolic order. And psychoanalysis allows us to see that our symptom, though there's a singular truth to it, is part of a vast array of social symptoms or social production. I'm just speaking nonchalantly, but I think with philosophy and with psychoanalysis, we get a new form of mediation to understand our personal selves. It's like what psychoanalysis promises us, if it could promise anything like a cure, is what Freud would call ordinary unhappiness, right? And it's not like this, oh, I finally found out who I was supposed to be, I could be my true self, but rather you kind of get through the illusion or this distortion that the fantasy breeds of, like, yeah, I see this illusion, but behind this veil, there's something true. When really it's the fact that, no, the veil itself allows for that perspective of something outside of the veil. And I like what Dimitri was saying about, again, I'm kind of rambling on, but there is a point Dimitri was saying that Lacan talks about in 68, and this is where his whole seminar 17 on the four discourses becomes of great importance, about the hysteric and how these revolutionaries wanted a master and not freedom. Well, I think what the beauty and the merit of the Slovene school is that they give an accurate reading of both Freud and Lacan with people like Kant and Hegel. And Zizek talks about, perversion, and same thing with Alenka, of a sort of structure of our subjectivity that's rooted on disavowal, when we have knowledge of the horrors that are going on, and yet this knowledge allows us to carry on. And there's a meme that I saw, and I think it's from an actual interview that Zizek had, where he says, you all are perverts and are secretly horny for the apocalypse. So rather than wanting a master, we want an end of the world, and just this sort of fetishization of doom. And for me, I'll say lastly, it's like, from reading not only Lacan, Freud, in seminars, and undergoing analysis myself, and then also reading the Slovene school, I'm drawn between these two distinctions. On the one hand, you have the clinic of the real, And someone like Jacqueline Miller talks about how we now live in a sort of generalized foreclosure versus the Slovene school with perversion and an instrumentalized superego as our mode of society. But I think that ultimately what we see is a different form of a symptom in which we have a sort of deterioration of this is what someone like my mentor Mark Gerard Murphy and then someone like Dwayne Roussel talk about the collapse or the disintegration of a social bond. And so it's leaving me in this sort of deadlock between, are we generalized foreclosed or are we in a sort of super ego injunction? Because on the one hand, you could see if with generalized foreclosure, it doesn't mean that we're actually psychotic, but it means that the way that the knotting of our Borromean knot makes us situated in language to which we could say something, but yet we don't have a sort of signifier, a unary trait that kind of, keeps us to the social bond. You could see with the saturation of social media and stuff, information and fast production, that it's so much imaginary information that we have no symbolic coordinates to hold on to. And so like when you look at Schreber, he creates these neologisms. It's like we're creating neologisms in reaction to this to try to hold on to some type of symbolic order, but we end up foreclosing. But then on the other hand, if we see that there's a deterioration for a master signifier, the pervert will try to create one and also expose lack in the other to try to sadistically, pervert in a perverted way, be an other for an other. So that's kind of what I've been coming up with so far in these two camps. On the one hand, the Clinic of the Real from Miller, generalized foreclosure, and perversion and disavowal from the Ljubljana school.
That's fantastic. I mean, there's a lot there, and I want to get Nick to jump in a sec, but I just wanted to say, because I recently had a conversation. It's not out yet, but with Julie Reich, who wrote the Negative Psychoanalysis of the Living Dead, and she even said that she says that when Freud talks about the cure for the cure of psychoanalysis as ordinary unhappiness, for Julie, she says this is too positive. Mm-hmm. This is too positive. With everything with Julie, we have to get more negative. And she was saying, actually, in our talk, she was like going from, actually it was quite helpful. She was talking about we need to go from cure and therapy orientation to care orientation, which is more like a hospice. And like this would be like therapy is for life, but a hospice is for death. So it's like this in between. This was a very interesting notion, and Andrew, I think keeping my own perversion would be a very interesting paper. Mm-hmm. Thinking about the relationship between psychotic foreclosure and perversion in the Miller school and the Slovene school. That's really interesting. Nick, did you have any thoughts on this relationship between the personal and the
Sure, yeah,
and the theoretical?
I like what you were just saying, quoting Reich about us being beings unto death, essentially. And I think that, strangely enough, although for those who are unfamiliar with psychoanalysis, it might seem counterintuitive to connect speech, death, and sexuality. I think this is where we can find the intersection of the personal and, well, let's say the philosophical, the theoretical. And it's only appropriate that we juxtapose the écrits with the seminar, because both have their own sorts of inflections on this central question of, what is the connection between speech, the way that, as Lacan says in Seminar 1, the past history of the subject is historicized in the present, and that can only emerge through speech and through the speech act, through the productions that come forth in analysis. And I think one of the benefits of reading ÉCRITS and reading it alongside this seminar is that we have two different approaches to speech. You know, people wonder why Lacan is so damn obscure, so impenetrable. Is he just a French asshole? Or is he doing something else? Well, it's a little bit of both. No offense to the French. We love the French. But it's like, yes, he exists in this milieu that is comprised of highly intelligent, highly educated people trying to impress each other. He comes from a sort of surrealist Dada background to an extent, and there was a period of time, I guess, the 20s or so, around that time, where it's like making puns and playing with language and being very elusive in your explication of ideas was popular. But I think that is a reductive approach to what he's doing. At least, let's say, in the ÉCRITS, the fact that everything he writes can be read in at least 4 different ways and force you to, in some way, like, go back and retroactively connect what he's saying with, you know, the main clause of the sentence, for instance. You know, he has these long multi-clause sentences, and you have to go back to even find what the subject of the sentence itself is, because you can get lost in the tortured maze of his prose. And it is very frustrating, but it's beneficial because it's written for analysts. In the seminar, Andrew and I always emphasize this: Lacan is the analysand. In the ÉCRITS, he's writing as an analyst. And in the seminar, he's letting the general public, well, not the general, obviously a choice group of people, analyze him in a sense. When you read these together, you get the full analytic experience, which to me has to do with the limits of language and what we refer to when we talk about the limits of language, the frame itself that becomes part of the content. You know, Zizek often emphasizes this, is none other than the phallus, right? This is the meaning effects as a whole, that thing that's impossible to get at because it is a signifier and it stands for meaning itself, so it's completely empty. When we undergo analysis, and Andrew and I are both in analysis right now, what happens is it's not just, oh, it's difficult to talk about the most deeply personal issues in your life. Sure, that's true. And that would be true of any therapeutic experience. But what separates analysis from other therapeutic experiences is that because you're met with silence many times, or what you could interpret as indifference, or just the enigma of the analyst when you present your life, you know, on a platter, so to speak, you find yourself alienated by the very words that you produce. And what you thought was so intimately you, your essence, in you know, once articulated, you no longer recognize yourself in it. It's there's no reflection that is brought back to you. So what does this mean? Well, it shows how death isn't just something that will happen to us one day. We have to prepare for it. We never know when it's coming. You're here one day, you're gone the next. Death is something that is actually intimately, it intimately like permeates our entire life. In a sense, it's already happened. And that is revealed through speech and sexuality. I want to bring this back to what Dimitri was saying earlier, which is very interesting about Marcuse. and why this, very, very, I think like garden variety interpretation of what analysis is doing, what Freud is doing, what he's saying in terms of its like superficial political rendition of his ideas is just that like, oh, well, we have, certain sexual desires that we can't satisfy or can't admit to ourselves, and that's what's repressed, and we just need to articulate what those desires are and maybe act on those desires, and then everything will be okay. It's like, no, the repression that Freud is talking about is it's a repression in the unconscious, and the unconscious is sexual. And when he says sexual, it's not about sexual practices, it's not about sexual attitudes, it's not about values, it's about this radical negativity that exists and shapes the very curvature of the space where we have the symbolic order. And that is the essence of sexuality, speech, and death, as they're all interconnected in Lacan and Freud.
Yeah, that was a brilliant description of analysis, Nick, and it just reminded me of what I'm taking, in designing the course to be almost the central point of the Écrits, or what it seems to me is he seems to be questioning the existence of analysts, at his time, like that's like seems to be like one of his big gripes, even like a central gripe is like he's kind of like, I get this feeling like he's saying, are there any analysts? Like he's like I'm pretty sure Freud was an analyst, but what he seems to be getting at, and then I'll throw this out as a question to all of you, if you've had a personal contact with this maybe, but it seems like he's saying what's gone on in the International Psychoanalytic Association is that the analysts have just made their own ego the standard of analytic practice. And so instead of like getting this brutal confrontation with a death figure where you feel like this alienation of your speech, just the echoing around your, and that's how I love there's so many beautiful, there's such beautiful prose, I think, in Lacan as well, when he says, like, for example, in the overture to this collection, discourse being the echoing the echoing locus of our own discourse, like we just get the reverberation of nothing coming back to us,
Right.
But any thoughts coming out there about the ego, death, analytic practice? Andrew, you seem to be jumping in.
No, definitely, and those are all good points, because when we look at the seminars, right, especially the first three, and it's quite interesting because when you look at the Écrits, these early essays before the seminars, the people will always say, like, generally, like, oh yeah, this is early Lacan. So he was like in this imaginary phase, he hadn't worked out his ideas. Yes, but also no. He was definitely jumping around the scene. He was a psychiatrist, obviously, and he was reading a lot of Freud. But when he's doing this stuff, and he's also starting seminar 1, he's already in his like late 40s, like 50s, I think. So he's definitely has everything already down. But like, as far as developing a system of how to, again, as Nick says, talk to a selected group of people, which are analysts. It's not like he's talking with specifically academics. It's not until like he makes his stuff public because of getting kicked out of the IPA that he's opened it to more philosophers. In fact, I only think the only philosopher that's in his seminars is Hippolyte during that time. So Nick's point about him talking as an analysan in these seminars is because he's training analysts, and analysts that are actually high level. So Sam McCormick of Lectures on Lacan says, in all this rambling, you should read the beginning and then the end of each lecture of each in the seminars, because that's where he quotes his point, and then he'll continue on. But what does this all have to do with your thing, or what you're saying about are there any analysts? It's because there's so much revision going on, and it could be something of a traumatic encounter. But Freud was not a psychologist. He's the father of psychoanalysis, but it's like out of mere chance, because he was training to be a scientist. He was a neurologist. And so if you read his scientific paperwork, it's a theory on neurons. But he realizes how with that and his work with Breuer on Anna O, how hysteria works, in his earlier writings on like repression and excitation, then he starts to develop his practice. And because of Lacan, we understand retroactively what's going on with analysis, right? And the clinic of neurosis, that we've forgotten the roots of what Freud was trying to bring down. And I think even for Freud too, because Freud realizes, well, the ego is not the master of his own house. This is his Copernican revolution. But I think with his theory of the death drive, it made him realize that Freud is not the master of his own technique. But with Lacan, we resuscitate the importance of not only sexuality, but the death drive. And the problem of negating this or just covering this up, which was what he was seeing in all this analytical work, is that you get these different types of revisions of a two-body psychology, ego psychology, object relations, other forms of psychotherapy, behaviorism in America and the Anglophone community. But what does this have to do? What's wrong with that? Well, they want to sort of use Freud when it's convenient and then negate Freud for their own, sake of like keeping their altar of ideas there, or as Lacan will say, juridical astrology with psychology. And so the problem is that, well, back to what I was saying about Lacan and the imaginary. Yes, he was focusing on the imaginary, but insofar as that it has to deal with the registers and that there is a real of the imaginary, that fails. So when we look at the 6 paradigms of jouissance, I said 7 because Isabel Millar has a 7th paradigm. But the 6 paradigms of jouissance, we have a jouissance of mastery in the clinic of the obsession. We look at Kojelev's dialectic of master and slave, and a little bit of Hegel as well, that the master is created by the slave who wants to avoid death, but not death of the body, or actual death, but death of being something for the other. So this alienation in the mirror stage is something of a misrecognition. And he says, this is why we don't focus on the ego, because the ego is a misrecognition. And as you said, Cadell, the ego in the clinic is nothing more than the analyst's ego as a standard. And so we continue to maintain this two-body psychology. And so this is why the unconscious in speech is important, because you realize that there's a failure of mastery and of jouissance in the imaginary, because the image is a sort of fragmentation and also an anticipation that relies on an other. And for the neurotic creates this imaginary scene and needs a sort of other to kind of help in this triangulation. And this is where we get Oedipus and stuff like that. But what I'm trying to say is that, like, for Lacan, he wants to get back to the Freudian technique with his structural linguistics, with his registers, and all this stuff, to realize we have to resuscitate this project because we're not leading to anywhere but back to the beginning of what Freud was talking about. I hope that makes sense.
No, there's so many good points there. I mean, yeah, just in terms of what's going on throughout Lacan's career, starting with the seminars and building up to the point of his return to Freud. Nick, did you have anything you wanted to make a point on this this distinction between the ego, death, analysis?
Sure, yeah.
Dimitri, after that.
I'll try not to go on too long here, but I think we need to keep in view this understanding of the ego as a misrecognition and as a byproduct. And this is a really revolutionary idea. And it is latent in Freud's system. What Lacan is trying to bring to the fore is the system that within Freud, as it is encapsulated in the Borromean knot and 3 registers, which of course Freud himself didn't have, but which Lacan was convinced essentialized, Freud's system. Now, this idea of the ego as a byproduct or a misrecognition, it is completely integral to Lacan's whole project, because what he was witnessing at the time that he was a practicing clinician was this approach to the ego that, as you were saying, Cadell, posited the analyst's ego as a model for the, let's say, for lack of a better term, weak ego of the analysand, as if the ego can be rehabilitated to a point where one better aligns with, I like the way Lacan puts it in Seminar 1, the little man within the man, right? That there's this sort of like homunculus of who you really are, who you could be, and it's lost in the haze of, I don't know, everyday life, and we just need to be brought back to it, and through kind of guided practice, we can get there. No, the picture is not so rosy, Lacan says. The reality of the situation is that the ego as a byproduct, and he perfectly illustrates this with the optical schema, which is, there are a lot of moving parts to that, so I won't get into it, but the ego as a kind of byproduct is something that the neurotic, at least, must in some way keep a distance from, something that the neurotic plays with, something that removes the neurotic from the truth of their desire as it exists in the unconscious. And to reinforce the ego, on the other hand, is to further reinforce the neurotic's placement in the imaginary and neglect the other two registers in a sense. But the real always emerges no matter what the case. Right now we're living in a moment in time where this reinforcement of the imaginary ego is, you know, it's more prevalent than it's ever been now that therapy and therapeutic talk is part of everyday discourse. So this is one of the benefits of reading Lacan, is he trains us to carve up the world in a different way and recognize our misrecognitions. I hope that made some sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, Dimitri, I know, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not sure if you've been to analysis or not, but what's coming to your mind with some of these reflections, and maybe more importantly, what do you think about therapy culture today, and how do you think analysis, intervenes in therapy culture in a sense? I know this is something that Andrew's also written about extensively, but
Yeah, well, I like how Nick and Andrew just put it. And I would say that the ego is a byproduct, and the ego is like Lacan say like Lacan says, a frustrated image that comes from impotence. So wherever there's the ego, you can say, okay, there's impotence here. And of course, it's the ego that wants to make it seem as if there's no impotence. Just like the pathological narcissist wants to come off as confident, whereas this is actually exactly where the insecurity lies. And this is also, if we want to talk about the registers, something that's so important is that the truth is, the truth is in the appearance, or the real is in the image. There is a very prevalent spontaneous ideology, both in therapy as well as in people who just encounter Lacan, which basically relies on the belief that you can separate the real and the image, and that the real is outside of the image, and that we have to get you have to push the image out, or something like this, or that we have to abolish the image, or that there's a lot of misreadings with Hegel here too, that absolute knowing is the overcoming of the image, but this is exactly not the point. And like, Hegel does believe that you can set aside the image. This would be to set aside what Hegel calls picture thought, and then you can do true thinking, which in its abyssal nature does hurt. Now, how it relates to therapy these days, I believe I mean, this is more Andrew's and Nick's domain than mine. I'm not really analyzing therapy as it is these days, but it seems to me to be like a reification of the ego. There's a lot of talk about positive affirmations, about cultivating neurotic rituals, which are euphemistically called self-care and things of that nature. You know, self-love is of course very much one of the master signifiers. And yeah, for Hegel, what's interesting is that for Hegel there is no such thing as self-love. He literally says it explicitly: self-love does not exist. And he also critiques Christ for saying, "Love your neighbor as yourself." He says, "Well, the true meaning of this is not that you know, you love yourself, and just like just in this way you should love the neighbor." So what's interesting to me in this is the question of, are there any analysts really? We could also rephrase it and ask the question: are there really any philosophers? Or in Hegelese, is there really like people with absolute knowing as such? Are there people who really can do speculative philosophy? And this gets also to the question of, is there really an end to analysis? And yes, Andrew, Freud, very early on, we have to say, did say that we can bring people from hysterical misery to ordinary unhappiness. It's not so clear to me whether he believed this to be the case in his more mature years. But then again, you know, Nick, you just said like there is a benefit to reading Lacan. So what is this? What is the nature of this benefit? You know, what is this cookie that we get at the end of reading, you know, these dense, obscure works like Hegel and Lacan? And well, there's a podcast Zizek did with Todd McGowan a few years ago already, in which Zizek says that actually the Troika, Alenka, Mladen, and him are kind of moving a little bit more away from Lacan and going more to Hegel. Now, what that exactly means is, of course, a very complex question, but there's an article Zizek wrote about the end of analysis. And at the very end of the article, he basically says that the end of the analysis is best described by this quote of Hegel in his encyclopedic Logic. Now, what this quote by Hegel gets at, I will not I will not read it out loud. It's a bit too convoluted, perhaps. But it gets at the logic of what Lacan called the non-all, which is a logic where there is this is again one of the most complex issues in Lacan, I believe. But this is a logic of, one could say, total inclusivity, which also includes the very gap of that inclusivity. In other words, the logic of the non-all includes its negativity, and therefore it's never complete as such, or open-ended in a sense. Now, someone just asked in the chat whether we could could escaping the symbolic via an overload in the imaginary be progress? Well, I don't really believe so, and like I said, the image emerges because of a lack in the symbolic. That's why the image appears, and that is where it comes as a veil. Now, Lacan, maybe Andrew and Nick, you know better about this than me, but Lacan wrote about the difference between alienation and separation. And at a certain point, he theorized the idea that, first of all, you are alienated from the big other, and then through the process of psychoanalysis, you become separated from the big other. Well, there's something to be said about this very moment of disillusionment. And one way in which we could describe the process of psychoanalysis is that Lacan says, just like Freud, that transference is love. So by going into psychoanalysis, you will cultivate love, and you will fall in love with your psychoanalyst. You will put him into the position of the subject supposed to know. Now, in the very process of psychoanalysis, you will repeatedly stumble upon the fact that he is actually not that subject supposed to know, until you come to the moment where you cannot really hold this whole transference anymore, and you become, I guess, totally disillusioned to the extent that you become separated from him and cultivate like a certain kind of distance that is radically different from the distance that you had in alienation. Now, I believe this is similar to what Hegel describes when he writes about absolute knowing, you know, and like what is absolute knowing really? Well, I think it's in a sense completely insubstantial, because if you read the phenomenology of spirit, you get all these shapes of consciousness of spirit, yada yada. It's, and you go through all this hard work, this plowing through the book, and at the end of the book, there's the chapter of absolute knowing. You think you finally have arrived. You know, you're gonna get the benefit now. There's gonna be that cookie that you wanted all the time, and then it's just a retroactive looking back on everything that has taken place. Now, to Hegel, the ultimate goal of philosophy is reconciliation in the present. And this, and we can talk about like what exactly this means, but yeah, perhaps psychoanalysis has a lot to offer Hegel himself and here, and also the limits of Hegel, which I'm very much interested in.
Yeah, I think it's gonna be very interesting, just in terms of how much you've read Hegel to bring that into the Écrits course itself, because there's I mean, I think there's just so many of course important connections there. But in terms of what was being asked, I want to just encourage everyone in the live chat that we can start answering questions if there are any questions, and maybe we should start with the question that Dimitri already referenced a little bit, be getting some perspectives on it from Nick and Andrew. Secret Asian Dan says, and again, Secret Asian Dan will be in the class, so this will be an interesting thing to explore with him throughout the course, is, could escaping the symbolic via an overload of the imaginary be progress? What comes to your guys' minds when you reflect on a question like that?
Yeah, and maybe it's just the fact that we need to like define these terms of symbolic and imaginary, and also point out that these aren't some type of like moralizing things. Like, it's not like we're saying symbolic bad, imaginary good, real bad, or anything like that. And they're not separate. And this it's like we understand these terms in a sort of like categorized way in the beginning of the seminars, but ultimately they're interconnected. But I mean, we're talking right now, so there's no escaping the symbolic order. Now, there could be a foreclosure on the signifier, which means that one is not, hooked into the symbolic order, and that is what the psychotic is undergoing. And Dimitri was breaking down alienation and separation. So when we talk about it in like analysis, yeah, there's a separation from the other, because you realize that the other, big other, doesn't exist, right? But also doesn't exist within you. So it's like, what is it? Was it Nietzsche that says God is dead, but does he know it? Right? Is that Nietzsche that says that? So it's like, and then I know we talked about this in the Peter Rollins. It's like, not only Peter Rollins talked, but like not only do we kill God, but we have to kill God within ourselves. And so
I could be wrong, but I thought Zizek was talking about things like that. I'm not sure if Nietzsche did.
Okay, was it? Oh, yeah. But either way, like whoever said it, it's like that's like the point, at least for separation. But we should also understand, and this is like a mythic moment. It's not like a sort of developmental, evolutionary thing. But when we see, and this goes back to Freud, the baby, right? The baby doesn't have instinct. The baby is invested in autoerotism, a sort of drive that's just encapsulated but the world and nothing else. And it's through this necessary hallucination of images from the mother coming to nurture, and sort of through being also the arbiter of the law and prohibition, or of the phallus of the symbolic order, can admit the baby, the child, into the symbolic order. So not only do we get alienation, we also get separation. So the alienation is going to be the imaginary aspect, but the imaginary can't also exist without the symbolic. Zizek talks about this as the sort of, that there's a virtual point of the imaginary that hooks onto a symbolic order that allows for reflection and double inversion, double reflection. This is the logic of the signifier. But I don't want to like digress, but like my point is that through this, right, the baby ends up getting more and more like libidinal investment in these hallucinations. And then we go from autoerotism to narcissism, which for that, it's not like the DSM-5 version saying like, oh, somebody that's like in love with themselves, like a sort of sociopath or a manipulator type thing. No, in fact, we all have a sort of narcissistic investment. It's when libido is then gravitated towards the body, but an image of the body, a fragmented body. And this is what we see in Lacan's early essay of the mirror stage. So we're still in the process of alienation right here. The one that is geared toward an imaginary representation. And then through language, as Lacan would call it, the name of the father, which is also the know of the father, we get the separation into what's a symbolic order. And Lacan will even say that like you kind of only need like 4 words to make 4 signifiers to make a language, but ultimately like one signifier is sort of the container for the entire order. Lacan says like you don't have to be able to speak, but if you have a word, like you're already in the symbolic order for the kids. He talks about this in Seminar 1 when he's talking about how language and speech operate. But the point being, for this question that Secret Agent Dan is asking, it's like we're always already in the symbolic. But what happens with the neurotic is that there is failed interpolation to adhere to the identification that happens after we enter the symbolic order, which is we go from narcissism to object love. And so this is the investment of libido into something of an object outside of them, right? And it's what the other has. And in some cases, sometimes when we get into psychosis, we get secondary narcissism, which is like this sort of 1-to-1 ratio, at least explaining it kind of simply, of investing into like an imaginary other that's very paranoid. But pretty much what I'm saying is, yeah, we can't escape the symbolic order, but the symbolic order or the signifier through, you know, a traumatic experience or whatever can foreclose on itself to where we enter in a state of secondary narcissism or psychotic foreclosure, in which we're nothing but an imaginary structure of the ego that's rooted in paranoia and delusions.
Doesn't sound like progress to me.
Nah.
I was thinking maybe it was somehow related to what you were talking about with those 2 sort of meta social analyses. You know, like on the one hand, the foreclosure psychosis, on the other hand, the more perverted instrumentalization of the superego. Is
Right.
how could we think about perhaps these 2 social and positions in relationship to this question might be interesting. Yeah, Nick, did you have any thoughts on this?
Sure. I mean, Andrew pretty much said everything, but the expression that came to mind is one that Lacan borrowed from Levi Strauss, which is symbolic efficiency. And so long as language makes sense, meaning relies on a kind of libidinal backdrop, so long as we can assume that another person is lying to us, or so long as we can assume that deployment of a specific signifier at a point in time, let's say like a vow. Lacan uses the examples of saying to someone, "You are my master," or you are my wife, my husband. As long as language has these effects, there is a symbolic efficiency going on. So what does that mean? Well, Deleuze and Guattari, they might believe that you can, in some sense, escape the prohibitions, the neuroticizing strictures of the symbolic via psychosis, right? Schizoanalysis. Still not exactly sure what schizoanalysis is. It's never been clearly explained to me. But Lacan thinks the life of the psychotic is not a very pleasant one. So, in a sense, yeah, there is such a thing as escaping. Maybe escape's not the right word. There is such a thing as a bypassing the symbolic. It's not exactly a voluntary move, but yes, the psychotic isn't exactly beholden to the same sorts of rules and regulations and constraints placed on the desire of the neurotic, but they are still struggling with the signifier at all times. They live through that struggle in a way that the neurotic is spared that by being kept at a distance from the truth of their desire. So it's also important, I think, to note that the Borromean knot, these three registers, they have to be thought together. You don't really progress from one to the other. This is a very common misconception about the registers, because Lacan's career is periodized in the same way. It's like Lacan of the imaginary, Lacan of the symbolic, Lacan of the real. We're supposed to think of them all together. That's why they're a knot. The whole thing about the Borromean knot is that if you remove one, the whole thing falls apart. It's all interdependent. Mm-hmm. So, in short, it's a really good question, but I would say no. There is no escaping the symbolic order in that sense.
But I do think, that example you were giving about, you are my wife, you are my husband, having a certain symbolic efficacy. I think that we can say that there's certain social phases where perhaps one aspect of the Borromean knot is getting highlighted or emphasized or exaggerated in some sense, where another aspect of the Borromean knot is in some sense either reduced or repressed or somehow obfuscated in some way. And I think that at least how I read the contemporary sort of social matrix, and also sort of bringing in my own personal relationship to the social matrix, I think what's really at stake is naming love. Simply and the inability, I think, of people to move through or move with the symbolic and love, and perhaps also because the real is too traumatic, the real is too devastating or something like that, but that maybe there's sort of an imaginary short circuit where I can just pretend that doesn't exist or something like that. I'm not sure if any of you guys I'd be interested to know what you guys feel about that.
Well, I think love happens because of the real. And whether or not we could talk about something called true love or not, I would think if there's anything called true love, it is just the fall, right? And embracing lack rather than loss. Because when we look at the registers, right, and I'll go back to psychosis, a big topic that Lacan talks about in Seminar 3, which is from one of the guys, I think it's Clarence Bolt, talks about erotomania and psychosis. But psychotics don't fall. They're not duped. Something about love, and it goes back to a great point that Dimitri talked about with transference, is that transference is love. It's sort of falling for that je ne sais quoi, the thing in you that's more than you, that you can't pinpoint, but somehow I know it more than you, that ecstasy that comes out. Psychotic doesn't have that, nor does a pervert really do that. The pervert, in fact, just instrumentalizes themselves in a sadistic or masochistic way, or even a fetishistic way. But the point that's important, and sometimes there's a lot of criticism of psychoanalysis or Lacanian psychoanalysis that, oh, the subject seems to be so neuroticized. Like, what about an autistic subject? What about these types of subjects? But so the point is that knowledge, if we could call something knowledge, is only able to be discovered because of the hysteric, because the hysteric is the one that actually wants to have knowledge. You know, am I a man or am I a woman? The knowledge that is also the sister, I think it's the sister or the cousin of jouissance, as Lacan will say in Seminar 17, but this interlinking of the two. But what does that have to do with your question is that, well, I think, and then something you said about one of these registers being repressed. Well, again, I would say that they're interlinked, and if one fails, the whole Borromean knot sort of fails as a tripartite. But we should see that with psychosis, it's the rejection of it, because the symbolic order or language comes as something evasive, something that's like almost persecutory, and will come up as a fear of castration, of losing something. And with love, we are not only recognizing our loss, but that we also never lost anything to begin with, because it's like giving something you don't have to someone who doesn't want it, right? And so it goes back to, again, transference. This is a very interesting term, because it's like we could talk about it, we could simplify it, but it's also something that's, we can't essentialize. But it's the subject supposed to know. It's positing the analyst or somebody as a subject supposed to know, or a post that is supposed to have, but you're caught in your own sort of misrecognition that you work through. And it's kind of like the same reason with love. Daniel Garner from OG Rose kind of said something that I really like, and I still use this to kind of simplify it. It's that love is not only just a beautiful thing, but it also brings out the sort of pathologies that you really wouldn't have known you had until you fell for the person, and vice versa. It's not like this person was always toxic or always jealous. It's just it happens to manifest within the act of falling and realizing lack. But for the psychotic, they don't deal with that. And my thing about erotomania was that there's this like emphasis of like certainty that somebody is stalking them because they have like, you know, erotic feelings for them, or that they stalk somebody else and try to intrude into their space and get inside them. But it has nothing to do with being duped in the way that love manifests for the hysteric and the obsessional, because even though it's a non-relation, it both has to deal with desire and what the other is for them and what they are for the other, and traversing this sort of fantasy aimed around not only desire but also of the drive. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it's actually very helpful, and I love that notion that love is not just a beautiful thing, but also brings out all of those pathologies. And it strikes me that when we think about this dialectical relationship, perhaps between the society of the instrumentalization and the society of the psychotic imaginary, is that we're doing everything possible to avoid the non-relation. We're doing everything possible to avoid, you know, basically that.
Because the pervert thinks that there is a relation, and that's the main thing why they don't have love. They think that they are it. They think they're the other for the other.
Yeah. So there is a question here which is directed at Andrew, but also all of us. Is he said Luis says, Andrew mentioned the fragmentation of sensation. Could he or anyone else provisionally talk about the relationship between this fragmentation and language? Maybe Andrew, you could start, and then we'll go around if you do want to talk about this.
Yeah, I don't remember saying a fragmentation of sensation, but I know I talked very fast, so maybe I might have slipped and said something like that. But I'm recalling when I talked about the fragmented body with alienation. So maybe it sounded like I said sensation rather than alienation. But yeah, so the question was, could there be a provisional talk about the relationship between fragmentation and language? Well, I think with alienation, right? It's a sort of, Dimitri talked about this in the beginning about the impotence and frustration. There is a frustration that is very much structured in this imaginarized body, And Lacan will say that there's a sort of paranoid structure of the ego. So one thing about the symbolic order or language is that, well, it allows a thing to die, but it also allows the thing to be preserved. So we have two moments of temporal time, an imaginarized version, which is very frustrating, and then the sort of temporal anticipation that allows for a moment of understanding. Now, this goes to what we'll learn about in the ÉCRITS, the logical time thing. But to kind of get at what he is talking about, this notion of the signifier is important in the symbolic order because it allows us to talk about things without them being here. Lacan will talk about the elephant in Seminar 1. What's the beauty of the elephant? The word? Well, the word could be used for anything. We could talk about the elephant's rights. We could talk about elephant coaching. We could talk about anything, and the elephant doesn't have to be in this room. And it's the same thing with just anything because language allows an aspect to be preserved. And when we talk about logical time, there's an anticipation and a moment of conclusion that comes about. Now, I had this essay where I played upon the mirror stage and the logical time essay as like sort of a way we could understand subjectivity in early Lacan. The only thing that's lacking is a sort of real, the real that we would see in Seminar 11. But one of the things that I think is important, though, is that we still need that look, that sort of imaginarized, intersubjective relation for sort of rules and structure to come about in these games. But what I'm getting at is that when we have that and a sort of odds or something that's pressurized upon us, we get a game that comes out of this. So I hope you don't mind me explaining the game. I don't want to like talk over like
Well,
too much.
I was just gonna say about the question of fragmentation and language. To me, it points towards that emphasis that Lacan always makes about the impotent body, and that we're that we have this specular image of an imaginary unity, and that like I really like that Lacan situates his anthropology or his understanding of humanity in just that simple, everyday, relatable fact that we're born totally impotent. We can't move. Our body's totally impotent, and then we have, and then quite understandably, it's quite interesting to think about this. I think is like to think about the child or the infant in relationship to these others, which apparently can do everything that I can't do. I can't shit, I can't piss, I can't eat, I can't walk, I can't talk. But all these beings around me, well, they can talk and they can walk and they can move around, and so I feel like this is, at least for me, like thinking about fragmentation and language like this a little bit.
Yeah, and that's a really great way to put it, because then we talk about how language then structurates like that fragmented body. It's like, no, you can't shit, you got to use the potty or you use the restroom. So like the way we associate stuff like that, or like the oral stimulate the drive of like the oral, it's like not sucking on the thumb or like begging like mom for breastfeeding. It's like, no, now you have food, right? So all these certain symbolic structured things are now occupying and inscribing themselves onto that fragmented body.
Yeah, Dimitri, did you have anything you wanted to add to this this question?
No, not to the question, no. But I do have something about what we were talking about before. Okay, we're all kind of hysterical here. We don't know what we want, and we kind of know that there's no one to tell us what we want, but we kind of do believe that, because otherwise, why the hell would we read Lacan? And in Freud's in one of Freud's papers, he differentiates obsessional neuroses from hysteria, and the basic difference Freud gets at, which Lacan does a lot with this and changes a lot here, but is that the obsessional goes through a trauma and then will basically have some kind of obsessional idea, will be fixated on an idea and try to work through it compulsively. whereas the hysteric will have like a bodily conversion of this symptom. Now, if we just take this distinction, if it seems like that, you know, as a philosopher or as a thinker or as someone interested in theory at large, or even something like literature or creative writing, there seems to be both obsessional and hysterical elements to this, insofar as one compulsively tries to work through an idea and through all kinds of different difficult structures, and it's trying to make sense of it. Well, but actually the truth of that is, of course, in the hysteria, or in other words, where the big other collapses, and the point at which you can point to the lack in the other. And I would say to come back around is that this is the benefit of reading not only Hegel and philosophy at large, but also reading Lacan. It's, to put it simply and colloquially, disillusionment and negativity. And not only the very experience, but also staying aware in that very experience, which is the hardest thing to do, because that's what we would like least to be aware of, right? So what's central here is love, and Hegel theorizes nothing but love. Nothing but love. For Hegel, God is love, and God is the absolute idea, and everything happens within the absolute idea, and everything that's outside the absolute idea is outside the absolute idea as being within the absolute idea. So in a sense, nothing really exists but love. Now, of course, there's different kinds of existence. There's Dasein, there's concrete existence, there's actuality, but this is beside the point. What is central here is love in Hegel, and also in psychoanalysis itself. Now, we've talked a little bit about sexual liberation, the sexual revolution, and therapy culture, which is all about bringing out your own authentic self, and, you know, just reveal your true self and its beauty, and things like this. One of the things that Zizek says that is really inspiring to me right now is that it is not sex that has to be liberated today, it is love. And then when we go to Hegel, we read Hegel saying reconciliation in love is a liberation. So if we follow those two guys, it means that we liberate love so that we can be liberated in love. So how does this relate to disillusionment and the lack in the other, and the very separation to the other, and the end of analysis? I would like to ask all of you this question right now. Cadel, can you? What do you think about this?
Specifically about to liberate.
About the liberation that we, about liberating love, so that we can find liberation in love, and how this relates to disillusionment or the end of analysis and negativity specifically. Yeah, so I want to start by emphasizing my weakness and my impotence, because Samuel McCormick was talking about how weakness and love are connected, and I just want to sort of presence right now that I mentioned to you guys before going live. I not feeling so well, and that feeling has deepened. And I'm gonna keep going on, but I'm extremely dizzy, and my thinking is all messed up, and that's a really, I don't know if I have corona, but that's the only other time I've had this experience before. But let me just try and hopefully I don't sound ridiculous as a consequence of of this, but I'm feeling really weird. Well, at least we can have a laugh out of it if you. Yeah, I think I wanted to bring it out just so we could have a laugh about it a little bit, because I'm super dizzy.
Lacan has an effect on some people.
Yeah, but you know, I think I like the meta. I keep on bringing it up because I really like thinking about this. What Andrew was talking about the the perverted instrumentalization of the superego, and then the psychotic foreclosure or the clinic of the real. And I really think that the it's a really interesting dialectical structuring point, because beyond those two positions, I do think the stake is love, something about love, something about the non-relation, and something about affirming that. And I think that does come only when we move from the autoerotic, the narcissistic asphyxiation to the object love, right? Like we can't, if we're in a society, it seems to me like the pervert is basically trying to bring out either their autoeroticism or their narcissistic disposition in some sense, and using and just using, and then consequently, in my experience, not naming any names, but using other people as tools, right? Just indispensable, replaceable. And that's my biggest problem with the contemporary culture. My biggest problem with the contemporary culture is that people treat other people as replaceable, right? Like, because it's easier to treat people like replaceable than it is to go through a real relationship where you're inevitably going to encounter lack, both in yourself and the other. And you know what? If you have a real relationship with someone, over the course of years, that person's going to piss you off. That person's going to rub you the wrong way. They're going to say something that you don't like. They're going to, it's not always going to be pleasurable to be around. But I think there's something intrinsically valuable about going through those struggles, learning about lack inside oneself, learning about lack inside the other. And I really think that's the stake. And maybe the on the psychotic end, maybe they just don't have, I don't know if I'm wrong here, but maybe they just don't have the symbolic working through capacity. Like when like, here's my experience of it. My experience of it was being extremely attached to the symbolic in terms of girlfriend and boyfriend. Right? It's going to sound silly, right? But like, we all know, like, say, you go back to high school, like about when you were thinking about girlfriend and boyfriend and just these types of, and it has a huge degree of emotional impact. And then going through the catastrophe of that, and going through that falling apart, and then not knowing what to do with yourself symbolically. I think, again, these are the stakes. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, no, I want to add something.
Can I just respond to this quickly? Yeah, I think that's, I couldn't agree more on this point, that it seems like the culture really stimulates using other people as means and not as ends in themselves.
Yeah. And we'll go Andrew and then Nick.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything about this politics of love. I know, like in the symposium, Mark Murphy had an essay that he talked about called Antigone, which is moving from a politics of desire to a politics of love. And, the whole symposium was about going to the end. And it's like, now it's like we want everything without, the necessary steps to go through it. So like, we want, coffee without cream. We want soda without the sugar. We want, beer without the alcohol, right? Non-alcoholic, beer and stuff like that. We want coffee without the caffeine, and we want love without the fall. You see in a lot of relationships, yeah, I'm into you, but I just don't want to hurt you, or I'm just not trying to get emotionally invested. Like, they want to find this ideal partner, or they want to wait for the right time where they're finally their true selves and healthy. But it's like you end up falling in love or being
the
duped.
Right time.
Yeah, and duped when you least expect it, and you don't get healed. It just brings out, as I said earlier, the pathologies that were already not already within us, but that we didn't realize until the encounter with the other, or as a missed encounter, as it keeps continuing to happen. But the more you fail, the more you die better.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I love, and I'll probably say it to the day I die, and Nick knows this, but in seminar 2, there's this sort of error that happens within the symbolic order and repetition, and he calls it the machine. It breaks down, but then something new occurs. So he tells a joke to describe how death drive operates, or compulsion repetition. He says that there's an idiot boy that walks into a funeral after having seen the family in so long, and he says, "Many happy returns," and everybody gets mad and starts beating him up and says, "You're not supposed to say that. You're supposed to say, 'May God rest his soul.'" So then a couple weeks later, he goes to a wedding, and right when the groom was about to say "I do," he says, "May God rest his soul," and then he gets beaten up. And so that's how we learn, by getting it wrong until we come to a new discovery, and that's love.
Yeah. Well said, Nick. You gotta do you have a sermon on love for us, Nick? Can you take us to church, Nick?
I have an entire catalog of sermons for every occasion. So let's see. All right, deploy the love sermon. Let's think about what Slavoj says about love. Love is evil. Why is love evil? In addition to tulips, for some reason. Well, it's like one of the tenets of Lacan is that, we are this excess, right? We were talking about the ego being a byproduct. The human being is the excess of, for lack of a better expression, creation, let's say. There's nothing to do with us. We are unaccountable in a way. And I think that we can link love in this sense to failure. In lieu of everything else, we love. And as Zizek says, we choose something random, we pluck something out of the entire array of, meaningless, imaginary garbage that we encounter and say, I love this thing. You've seen those shows where it's like, there are people that love, we were talking about object love. They literally love objects right there. I saw something about a woman who is in love with the Eiffel Tower. This is a real thing. She married the Eiffel Tower. But why is that any less meaningful than any other kind of love? Love for another person, love for an animal, which we know is illegal most places if taken too far. But
sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, the whole point is that it is this failure. It's a very resolute, I think, acknowledgement of this failure. And one of the points or one of the purposes, we can call it that, of analysis is to get to this point of having a love of weakness. Love, weakness, and failure, to me, are all associated. But what were you going to ask?
I was going to say, and yeah, this might be an interesting topic to riff on, but if I think about, for example, someone falling in love with the Eiffel Tower, or for example, let's use something that may be more funny that is actually like pretty actual, is like people falling in love with anime characters. Right, or like getting married to, like, literally their proposals to marry an anime character, or like I don't know, that could get weird, right? Maybe even like we're getting into the territory of people wanting to marry a sex bot or something like that, Right. I could imagine that happening pretty soon if it hasn't already happened. Is that the difference between that and loving another human being? Is that a human being can talk. In other words, there's language. And I always thought, like, the zero level example I always give for this is like when a family needs a pet to almost show their love to the pet, but they struggle to show love to each other. And that's always a really weird thing. But isn't it something to do with language? Isn't it something to do with being in language and the extra negativity that comes with that? I'd be interested to know what you guys all think about that.
Yeah, I mean, and just to sort of actually negate what I was driving at there, Something else Lacan says is that when you marry someone, you submit yourself to that person. You find your freedom in the limitations that commitment to that person impose on you through that act. So I think the signifier is also really important here. And another thought that comes to mind, it's not exactly related to what I just said, but is this logic of metonymy. How metonymy, of course, is the part serving for the whole. Because we are these incomplete and uncompletable, if that's a word, beings, we choose some random, contingent, fragmented aspect of the other to lock onto. And we hope in this intersubjective way, in terms of what you're saying, that the signifier will bridge that gap symbolically. But the signifier is a very fleeting thing. It's not easy to pin down. Ask any Lacanian what the signifier is. You'll get 100 different answers because there is no univocal real understanding of what it is. And the logic of the signifier itself is an even more elusive question. But I guess like what I'm getting at is that, you know, I love the example that Lacan uses of two people not knowing what they are for one another, really, and that, you know, love is very threatening in that way too, in that it's easier to imagine that the other wants to destroy you, hates you, sees you as something to be destroyed than to not know. And when you say to someone, I love you, I want to be with you, I want you to have my life, I want a portion of your life, it's like you're saying to that person, there's something in you, more than you, that I want. You don't know what it is. I don't even quite know what it is. And that's a very difficult position to be in. And that itself is this fall. And I think that the moment that we're living right now is one where people are very resistant to that fall because it encroaches upon this imaginary wholeness. This, we were talking about the fragmented body.
It's like the imaginary wholeness to the part object.
Exactly. And it sets in relief our own fragmentation.
And the part subject.
Yeah. Yeah. The bar is what we're talking about here. The bar is all the more pronounced in this dynamic. And that's scary.
And the radical contingency. Yeah. Because I think like I was watching some reality TV shows of Indian matchmaking services. You know, so in Indian matchmaking services, it's basically old style traditional matchmaking. Like, we're going to link you up. You guys you're basically going to coffee with someone who you're planning to marry, like maybe a month from now. Mm-hmm. And at least in this culture, they prefer that sort of background preparing the guarantee.
Right.
Which is what it is, right? It's a guarantee. You're not going to get rejected, right?
Wouldn't you say it's the same thing even now with the way like certain people?
I think Tinder is like that, or
yeah, not just that, but it's like, oh, you're a Gemini. No, like the way they will use astrology to kind of like guarantee that they're the perfect match.
Oh, Leos go well with Geminis, or
yeah.
That's ridiculous. That's just beyond.
If your credit score is lower than 700, don't even talk to me.
I think the crucial thing that I like about love is, it's not that I like about love, it's actually in some sense really difficult, is the violence of the contingent one person, you know? Like there's a certain violence there because that one person and what's violent is the exclusion of everyone else. And what is this logic of the sexual revolution? Is the logic of the sexual revolution is a radical inclusion, right? So that they don't want that radical exclusion, just that person and everyone else can go, go bite it.
Right. Yeah, because
Yeah.
I mean, I think Alenka even said this to us in the What is Sex course, was that the sexual revolution and what we could see now, in this sort of perverse mode of production, is that we don't have love, but we just have different positions of enjoyment. And it's like, that's what we want, rather than having the fall, because there's no position, there's no ground for you to be in. You're working through,
Yeah. I mean, I think this conversation has been interesting. It's been stimulated by Dimitri. And Dimitri, you asked the question about love to me. And you've been studying the work of love. What's coming to your mind with some of these reflections on love and everything today?
Yeah, I really enjoyed hearing what everyone has had to say about this, and there is, of course, love. There's different, as everyone knows, there's different Greek words for love. You have eros, agape, philia, but I would like to paraphrase what Zizek applied that to love, and that is that I believe it's in Less Than Nothing. Might be in another book too, but he says that. So when we talk about the big other, like a lot of things in Lacan, it can mean different things. Probably has at least 4 different meanings, right? So we could say, like, okay, there's the big other 1, the big other 2, the big other 3, and the big other 4. We could make a categorization of the different ways that the big other is being used. But Jesus says we should actually not do this and leave the big other to be in this ambiguity. Because then it has more, let's say, speculative power, or it will have a good effect on true thinking, let's say. And I think the same should be the case for love. Now, maybe to separate eros and agape has something to it for sure. But love is tremendously ambiguous, and as Hegel says, love is the most immense contradiction. So I'm interested in the question of, like, what is love, not only in in my personal life to a woman, but also the love for a man, and especially the love for a dead man like Lacan, like Hegel, the transference to that one has for a dead man, and working through the oeuvre of this person, because there is no instant gratification with Lacan or Hegel at all. It's purely symbolic mediation all the way through, right? And that is already the benefit. Like, if you take the course, like, struggling with the text, like struggling to focus, struggling to pay attention, struggling to find time for it, that is all included in really learning Lacan and learning the theory. Having, like, making time not only to read, but also, to take walks, so that one can really integrate the text, which is something that I always have to do when I tarry with these dense works.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, I'd want to bring it around to this question you brought up, Dimitri, about these love of dead men, which is and juxtapose it with what Daniel Tutt was telling me in our conversation on psychoanalysis of the family, is that there's fewer and fewer spaces for basically mentorship, or older, younger men to go into sort of a type of transference relationship, essentially a student teacher relationship. That there's fewer and fewer spaces to do that. And are these supplements, are these substitutes for that lack, like or something like that? These are just some ideas.
Right. I think we'd have to listen to Lil Wayne's How to Love to really understand this, and How to Hate. No, I'm just kidding. But I really like what you pointed out, Dimitri, because it's like there is only just the big other, because everything else is just imaginarized little others. And I think that's important about the transference is that it brings out the speech or the discourse of the unconscious, which is the subject evoking the other, capital O, which is the effect of language. And this can't happen unless there is a transference. And with these like mentorships with the teacher, with the analyst, the doctor, these things are symbolic placeholders for an imaginarized person to bring out the questions concerning knowledge or one's symptom by evoking their desire and their own ignorance. Lacan has something on teaching in Seminar 2 where he talks about what does it mean to teach, what does it mean to be the student, and how does this relate to the big other? Because this is where he brings up his L schema of the imaginary and the symbolic, and how really like there is this intersection between the subject of the unconscious and the ego. And the subject, the ego is not the subject, but the ego is a sort of alienated imaginary aspect of the subject of the unconscious. And it's literally through analysis and its structure and its ability to allow for free association that we get glimpses of these discourses of the subject of the unconscious with the big other, which is inscribed with not only desire, but this demand for love. And I mean, you're talking about philosophy, Dimitri, and I think it's like, well, with philosophy too, in this mentorship, we get into this libidinal investment of the love of wisdom, which is, wisdom's love,
Can I just respond to this?
Yeah.
Because I mean, if you just open up a book by Hegel, and let's say you've never read Hegel, you see the structure, and then at the end you see these beautiful terms, absolute knowing, absolute idea. So of course, what you want to do is like go to the end of the book and see what's there. And in the end of Hegel's Science of Logic, he says something that's very strange, and that Zizek will talk about, but it's that the absolute idea. So the idea is basically this: you work through all the logical categories of being, essence, concept, and everything that it entails, up to the absolute idea. And then at the end, what does the absolute idea do? It decides to release itself into its other, or into nature. So you don't just become fixed with all the logical categories. You basically, a metaphor you could use is like you work through the entire book, 800 pages, you struggle with it, and then at the end of the day, you close the book and you go into daily life again. And like, okay, but so what's the place of the book in your daily life now? Well, it's the symbolic mediation that you've worked through, the struggling with that book, and also releasing everything, like not identifying with Hegel's abstract categories and trying to reify them and proselytize them. But it's like actually in the releasing that that Hegel sets you up to do. But you have to make the decision. And this is also gets at what philosophy cannot do, and psychoanalysis can also not do, is it cannot decide for you where to go next. It can only like work through the past to show, to reveal to the present what needs to be revealed, and it can set you up to make a decision. And that's where it stops.
I really like what you said about that, because in the beginning of Phenomenology, and I really like this, is he says something about going back to the eating of bread and the drinking of wine, right? And it's like what you're talking about, the notion emptying itself out, if I'm not mistaken. So, if you're aware in theology, the term kenosis of self-emptying into Christ, and it's like through philosophy or through the sacraments of eating the bread and the drinking of wine, yes, you consume God and the presence of the Holy Spirit, but then you empty yourself out into the world. What does this have to do with not only love, but psychoanalysis? But the fact is that you empty yourself out in analysis, and you eat your own Dasein, as Lacan will say, but you empty yourself out onto the other. And whether or not the cure is something that we can make a positive notion of in analysis, but the beauty is that with this emptying out of your discourse, you learn to scansion stuff. That's why a lot of people at the end of analysis become great writers, great poets, or even best, they go out into the world and they become analysts themselves and practice the path of love. Just like in, at least theoretically or spiritually, when you talk about theology and Christianity, when you consume the bread and wine, you empty yourself out into the world as Christ did.
Fantastic. So we can eat our Dasein, and I think this this metaphor for letting is, I think we should also defecate our Dasein a little bit as well. Remember to take that's. I remember the first time I read Less Than Nothing, I appreciated that emphasis of Zizek making that oftentimes when we read Hegelian scholars, there's too much eating and not enough defecating.
Right.
But Nick, you've been quiet for a while. I was wondering, what's going through your head right now?
I'm thinking about like kenosis and then subjective destitution. One could say that there's a certain approach to philosophy which is about building yourself up, and I think that might be in line with a kind of ego strengthening attitude that's very popular right now, if you can call that truly philosophical, but with self-improvement culture, the grind set, everything. There's this idea of, we're talking about partiality and wholeness, making oneself more whole, realizing your identity, and surpassing your limits. And psychoanalysis is a discourse, or science even, that pushes the very opposite. It gives you no real purchase in that regard. And that is a kind of liberation, but it's not the sort of liberation that we get from, I don't know, watching a Disney movie that you would surmise is owed to us by the world at large. We could take it in this direction. What's promised to us by, let's say, the commodity? No, it's the opposite. Freedom consists in stripping away every aspect of your imaginary identity until you're left with the excremental excess, which is what analysis is supposed to bring you to that point. And I like what Dimitri was saying before. It's like this process of disillusionment, as it exists in analysis, is also it initially the introduction of transference, which I forget who said this recently. Maybe it was Todd McGowan. That transference also it creates the symptom to address it, and then once it's addressed, if there is such a thing as the end of analysis, it is that this total disillusionment, even with the analyst, where that transference is now broken. It served its purpose, so to speak. Now it's broken, and now we are emptied out.
I think in I forget the exact text, but I remember Lacan saying that the relationship, the image that you're the subject's speaking in relationship to the analyst just dissolves.
Yeah.
So that like you're saying, there's this dissolution.
All
right, so we're
I was just gonna say, like, initially, Lacan thought the analyst is supposed to take the position of the big other.
Yeah.
But then over time, the analyst assumes the position of the of object A.
And that's I think bringing it back to, like, I think this one of the central importances of the écrit is that an analyst can't do that if they're using their ego as the standard for the analytic practice. So, and I think this is like, here's one thing that I think's maybe not emphasized enough. If the analyst has to basically be like an embodiment of death in some sense, or like a a total emptying, and be indifferent to indifferent to all of the subject's problems in life and traumatic history, and how emotional, I guess, how difficult it is to really be an analyst, and
Yeah.
and like that's a huge emotional burden.
Yeah, because one thing that Sam McCormick will always says, also shout out to Sam because we referenced him like what 3 times now, and I'll just make this quick, is that
Sam!
like, you know, the object A is not this thing that's just desirable and like sort of a virtual object that is like correlated with loss. It's a rejection. It's like the excremental excess that's rejected. And so the analysts themselves are also rejects because they don't fit in the university. They don't fit in the psychology institute. You know, yes, there are institutes that exist in Europe and in South America, but it's not like the way a university institute is, or like scientific research. So it's like that rejected scrap, right?
It is. Yeah, no, I think that's a super good point. And it brings me again back to another important point in the ÉCRITS, where Lacan's saying about the institutionalization of psychoanalysis, that there's nothing in Freud that justifies the institutionalization of analysis. That this move towards institutionalization could itself be the false step. But you do see a lot of analysts that, I mean, they might work in diffuse networks, but they're oftentimes sort of gone solo. Like I get this idea of a lone wolf.
Yeah. No, that's accurate. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been my impression, and that's a difficult path to walk, is to sort of accept as you get older, especially, that when you shed all of your imaginary identifications, which are sort of intensified throughout your social relationships, transference, that the path you're heading towards is more of a lone wolf path.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the suffering that I'm gonna have to deal with, because I'm planning on being an analyst. So
so you go on the lone wolf path.
Yeah, I'll be the lone wolf and cub.
All right. Well, good thing that you, the vanishing mediators, aren't a substantial 2, but a not 2. So then that might not be. So we're coming up, say, on the last 10 minutes, and I would like to ask each of you. I mean, I feel super grateful, you know, in the Work with Philosophy portal, to have met the people I have, to collaborate with the people I have. I mean, obviously, Dimitri, you've been a student for a while, but now you're sort of more of a, I guess, a teacher's assistant than a student, and you know, meeting Nick and Andrews, you know, through Theory Underground has been one of the greatest joys of my year, to be honest. And I really like what you guys are doing. You know, what do you guys feel going into this fall, moving through? By December, we're going to have moved through the ÉCRITS, and we're going to have many discussions about it. We're going to have exegetical reading spaces. We're going to get a chance to connect with many. We haven't even spoken about our guest lecturers yet, but they're going to have fantastic contributions. What are you guys feeling about the fall, and maybe what would you say to anyone out there who's on the fence about joining in? Maybe start with you, Dimitri.
Yeah, so if you are an outcast, and you've probably you wouldn't have been watching this if you weren't some kind of outcast, because that was probably what drew you to into psychoanalysis or philosophy in the first place. If you are an outcast and you're looking for some kind of network of outcasts, you're welcome at Philosophy Portal and the larger extended network that it's part in creating here on the internet, you know, including, for example, you guys, the Vanishing Mediators, but also many others. And this is, this is a beautiful historical moment that we have the privilege to create this kind of network of outcasts. You know, this is actually an ideal that Zizek has written about in the early 2000s, creating a community of outcasts. But I don't think community is the right word. I think we're a network, and perhaps that's all outcasts can be together also, to be outcast in a true sense, to be a network. So if you're on the fence, maybe like I think if I saw this course and I would be on the fence, it would probably because I would think that I wasn't properly developed enough to go into the ÉCRITS. But there is no there is no right time. Just like we've talked about with love, you know, there is no right time. And actually, this is a great chance for you to jump into the écrit because you're gonna have so many people around you and so many different chances to discuss, and write, and present on your own ideas to develop your own ideas. So that's yeah, that's what I would say to someone who's on the fence. Um, oh, what do I expect from this course? Well, I'm just gonna use the most perverted metaphor I can use. I'm just gonna try to spread my legs as wide as I can and be ripped apart as be ripped apart as much as I can bear, actually. So that's yeah, that's it for me. And I expect this yeah, it's kind of intimidating. The book is staring at me right now, from there. But that's what that's what I expect. And I hope to explore love with Lacan, and also I'm interested in humor, yeah, and how it relates to the unconscious. So those are the main things for me. Thank you.
I love that. I know, Dimitri, you're working on a paper called "The Work of Love," and my hope is that there's a lot of gold nuggets here in the ÉCRITS course that will just continue this work of love well into the new year. Nick, yeah, what about you, sir?
Yeah, I would say if you're on the fence about this course, learning Lacan is a great way to not get to know yourself. Meaning, join us in a mutual endeavor in alienation, in assuming our own alienation, assuming ourselves as the aliens that we are. And what I mean is that, all right, so Lacan is absolutely intimidating, deliberately so. These texts are not easy. They are designed to torture you. Lacan, as McGowan pointed out, is perverse. If we're going to apply any structure to him, it's probably perversion. And the way he writes is perverse. And at the very least, if you yourself, kind viewer, have any perverse inclination, then you can see us suffer through these texts and us grapple with them, and us can watch us, flounder at points. And I think, but there's something really satisfying about that as well. And another thing I'll mention, and this was something said to me by Michael O'Sullivan of the Zizek and So On podcast.
Oh, shout out to Michael. He's great.
We call him Michael and So On. Shout out to Michael and So On. He said, the great thing about Lacanians is that they've all traversed the illusion of mastery. So we are not approaching this text with any intention of mastering it. You don't have to have any background in Lacan to get something out of it. And oftentimes, maybe, let's say, in quotes, the more naive you are, the more ingenuous, the better the experience can be, in a way. So, yeah, join us in our mutual non-belonging.
Yeah, and just a shout out also to the first anthology at Philosophy Portal was titled "Enter the Alien." So it was precisely this idea of this mutual endeavor and alienation, assuming our own alienation and so forth. But the aliens that we are, I love that. Very well said. And let's end with the big sig.
Yeah, if you're on very, I guess if you have this desire to want to learn Lacan and learn the ÉCRITS and are interested in the course, but also on the fringe of joining because of maybe the text is too hard, but you're already you already have a transferential relationship with Lacan, so there's an ambivalence. And one thing about Lacan is that, or with psychoanalysis, is that you unlearn the way you learn, or unlearn your enjoyment. You are granted for the first time the ability to not enjoy, right? But one of the things is that Lacan's too difficult, or I'm not smart enough. I used to get this thing a lot with weightlifting or jiu-jitsu. It's like, I would do this, but I'm not strong enough, or I'm not fit enough. But it's like, you get fit by doing the thing. So you gain intelligence of a certain kind by reading Lacan. And so I would highly encourage, if you're interested in Lacan or thought about it, keep encountering the name because of all these other texts that you're reading, well, then that just means that you're getting closer and closer to, encountering your desire. And it's pretty much an unlearning than it is like an accumulative of knowledge, because it changes you. It changes you through the process. And that's what philosophy should do. And that's what psychoanalysis does as well. And so as far as what I hope for, like in this course, just to be able to read the ÉCRITS with a group of people, because reading it by yourself is not fun. Reading the seminars alone is pretty cool, but reading it with a cartel or a group is much better, and it's the same thing with the ÉCRITS. And just to be able to not only learn, but also to, discuss what I know and learn in the process of how to be able to disseminate these concepts to people that are eager, people that want to eat their own Dasein. And so I guess that's the only thing I look forward to in this course. And the last thing that I'll say, if you are interested in joining this course, be aware that the fun is over.
Yeah, the nightmare's just beginning.
As Lacan says, the fun is over.
Right. All right. Well, the fun is maybe the fun might have ended early this morning for me. I'm not sure how many days this brain fog is going to last, but I'm fingers crossed going to be fine for a week, which is the start of the ÉCRITS course. So for everyone watching, the ÉCRITS course will start September 3rd. It's the 4th official Philosophy Portal course, and just in the context of Philosophy Portal as a whole, this is not actually it's the second time I've taught psychoanalysis, in the sense that I did a course on the Freudian unconscious, but teaching Lacan is going to be, it's a whole other beast, because when you teach Freud, there's something accessible about his writing, and maybe it comes from his scientific background, maybe it comes from the fact that he was trained as a neurologist, but there's something about Lacan that seems to me to be much more literary, even musical, and that presents a new challenge. But I'm excited for the challenge, and I'm even more excited to be surrounded by some great people. So thank you, Dimitri, Nick, and Andrew, for coming on tonight. And for everyone watching, this is where we sign off. Philosophy Portal ÉCRITS course starts September 3rd. Links in the description, and have a great evening.